Well, hello everybody. My name's Vivienne Wilson. I'm a research nurse at the Western General Hospital in Edinburgh. I don't know where you guys are from, but that's where I'm based, and I cover the southeast of Scotland. But I'm also the relatively new patient trials advocate for Make Seconds Count. And I've been in post about 4 months now. I can't believe it's gone that quickly, but we've kind of launched a service which is now live, and we're coming into month 3. So my role is to support patients who are interested in clinical trials, find out more information about trials, or actually help them to find a specific trial if that's where they're at their cancer pathway at the moment. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how you can access a clinical trial, but that's not going to take anywhere near an hour. So what I thought I would do is give you a brief overview of things about clinical trials that I think are really pertinent to you guys with secondary breast cancer, specifically for you. And then we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. So if I don't cover something that you would have liked me to cover, feel free to ask it. I'm not an expert, I'm not a medic, but I've been in cancer research for a long time. So I've been a nurse, I've been a nurse for a very long time, but I've been a cancer research nurse for, I think it's coming up to 18 years. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it has been in breast cancer. So I'm happy to take any questions. I might not know the answer, but I can always find out for you if I'm not sure. So I thought it would be quite good. I've got a presentation to give, which we thought we would record as well, which might be useful further down the line as well. So we'll use that too. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of a few things that I think are relevant, and then we can take it from there at the end. So I hope that sounds okay. So I'm going to share my screen now. And I've got a bit of a presentation. So hopefully. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Okay. So I'm very aware that some people might know quite a bit about clinical trials already. Some of you might not know anything at all, might even have a couple of skeptics in the audience, I don't know. But it's just to give you a brief understanding of what clinical trials are and some of the things that I think are relevant, and we can take it from there. So this is what I'm going to try and cover, which I hope sounds okay for everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about what clinical trials are, the types of trials that are available, a bit about phases of trials and why that's pertinent and relevant to you, then a little bit about the advantages and also acknowledge disadvantages for some people, and then talk a little bit about how you can go about accessing a clinical trial. And then finally, what happens if you're approached and go into a study. So first of all, what are clinical trials? So I've got a couple of quotes here from a couple of well-known people. Cancer Research UK say that trials aim to find out if a new treatment or a procedure is safe, or if it's better than a current treatment, or has fewer side effects. And then Cancer Support Community, just expand a little bit. Clinical trials for cancer are research studies that compare the most effective known treatment for a specific type or stage of cancer with a new approach. And it can be a new drug, a combination of drugs, or a different way of using established therapies. And I'm going to expand on that in a little bit more detail and just talk about what clinical trials mean to us. I think one of the main points I wanted to highlight was that clinical trials are for patients at lots of different time points. It's not just when you've run out of treatment options. So some people think that, they'll go through the standard lines of therapy, and then when they've no other options, they might go to a clinical trial. But actually, that's not the case. Clinical trials are available for patients at lots of different time points, from diagnosis to second line, third line, fourth line, and beyond. And then when we do have run out of options, then we have the very early phase studies as well. I think that's an important point to make, because some people do get mixed up with that. Also worth pointing out that lots of our clinical trials have licensed drugs, and they might be used for a different disease type. So there's one example that I've come across recently in this job. So there's a drug called crizotinib. we use that. It's a licensed drug for patients with non-small cell lung cancer, but they're actually trialing it to see if it works and is beneficial to patients with lobular breast cancer and gastric cancer or stomach cancer. So we know a lot about that drug already, but we're actually looking at it to see what benefits it can do for another disease type. So we don't just do that randomly. There is evidence to suggest that may be beneficial, and that's done in the lab before we bring it to a clinical trial. But we're thinking that lots of our drugs we already know quite a bit about. It might also be that we've got a licensed drug and we're giving it at another time point. And we've done a lot of that over the years. So we've trialed things like tamoxifen and letrozole, exemestane, and looked at what is the best way to give those hormones and when is the best time. So we have studies, we've kind of exhausted that line now, but it's worth remembering that, you know, the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of the drugs within clinical trials are drugs we know about already. And of course, Herceptin was in a clinical trial way back when we were trialing it in the primary setting. So we knew it worked in the secondary breast cancer patients, but we put there was a massive trial across Europe and across America, looking to see if Herceptin was beneficial in the primary setting. A licensed drug at a different time point. And obviously that did change practice significantly, didn't it? It might be with another drug. So it might be that we've got a new drug or something that we know about already, giving it in a different combination. And we have a number of studies like that. And then we come on to the new and the novel therapies. So they might be given alone, we call that a monotherapy, or with another drug, i.e. in combination. And these are the ones that we don't know so much about. So they are the ones that we potentially don't know what the side effects might be. I'll talk about the kind of phases of study as we go along. Also worth pointing out as well that not every clinical trial has a drug attached to it. So we have biomarker studies or translational research studies, quality of life. So there's not another drug involved, but it helps the researchers to find better ways of treating our patients with secondary breast cancer and giving them the best quality of life that we possibly can. Worth also pointing out that lots of our therapies are in lots of different settings. So we have clinical trials for surgery, radiotherapy, and then of course our tablet forms. It can be oral, intravenous, so lots of different types, a real mixture. And that's when somebody says, what's a clinical trial? It's actually really quite hard to kind of say in a couple of sentences because there are so many variations. Worth also noting, I'll come on to the phases of study in a bit, but the main three phases that we're going to talk about is phase 1, 2, and 3. There are technically 4 phases of clinical trials, but phase 4 tend to do that's kind of marketing side of things. We tend not to see them so much in hospital. Ultimately, we're trying to optimize our treatment for our patients with cancer. So we can advance our understanding of tumor evolution, tailor our treatments to the individual, and develop new combinations of treatment. And of course, we've got lots of different types of trials. So if patients are ER positive or PGR positive, there's hormone trials. And again, it's looking at existing drugs or new drugs. And there's certainly a new hormonal therapy called giredestrant that's going through the kind of trial process at the moment. Our chemotherapy drugs, we know a lot about chemotherapy now, and we don't get many new chemotherapy drugs coming through. But what we do find within trials is that sometimes we'll have a chemotherapy with a new or novel therapy. And it might be that in combination they work better. And also there are occasions where it's a new drug making the chemotherapy better and more effective. So we still see chemotherapy drugs within a clinical trial. And then, of course, we come on to the newer therapies. So the immunotherapies that use our own immune system to fight and destroy cancer cells, and our targeted therapies that target a specific gene or a mutation on that cancer cell. And we have more of them than we have obviously ever had. And we call that our precision medicine. And so really targeting a patient's own genetics. And the biomarker testing, this is where it's not necessarily drug involvement, but when we're looking to see what is going on with that patient's tumour so that we can find different alterations, genetic mutations, and that sort of thing. And we learn lots from all of these clinical trials. So how were they delivered? So pretty much on the whole, running our NHS hospitals. I'm sure there are some places with private clinics and things, but within cancer, they're delivered with 24-hour attention and care, so delivered in our NHS hospitals. Always delivered in a dedicated area or a clinical research facility. So if you live in Edinburgh, it would be within Ward 1. If you're in Glasgow, it would be the Beatson and a clinical research facility there. Worth noting that every study has its own protocol, and we follow the protocol to the letter. So the care, the treatment, everything that we're doing, the follow-up, it's all together in our protocol, so that when we analyse all of our information, we can 100% say that that is accurate information. Always delivered by dedicated research staff. You do occasionally get additional blood sampling and additional scans, but we only do them, tends to be in the kind of earlier stages of a clinical trial, and we only do it if we have to. So by the time we get to the sort of later stages, we don't bring patients into having additional scans if we don't need to. One-off biopsies are occasionally used, tends to be in the very early phases of a study. Not very often, but it's worth mentioning that they do happen sometimes. And then, of course, we do use placebos sometimes. And I know the word placebo puts a lot of people off. I've known people say to me later that they were, didn't want to go ahead with a clinical trial because they heard the word placebo and they didn't want to be compromised and they didn't want to have no treatment. Realistically, that never happens. Care isn't compromised, but sometimes we might give a placebo alongside a standard of care. So we're giving a standard of care and something that we think might be better. But some of our patients, we don't know if that new drug is better or not yet. So we might use a placebo then, but you would still receive the standard of care. So it's not compromising care, but I am aware that it does put some people off. So just to talk a little bit about the phases of studies that you might be approached about. So every drug in every pharmacist, in every cancer centre, every drug has gone through this phase process. So every drug starts at the phase 1 phase, phase 2, phase 3, and on to phase 4. And our cancer trials and our cancer drugs are no different. So the first phase is obviously phase 1. We start with a tiny amount of drug. And ultimately, what we're looking for is checking to make sure that is safe for our patients, that our patients can tolerate it, and what is it doing to the body. And we call that, we analyse the blood and different other bodily functions. So we're looking at the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics. And that is looking at to see how the drug is absorbed, how it's metabolized, and how it's excreted. So we start off with a tiny amount of drug with small numbers of patients and only very gradually increase that dose. So we call this our dose finding phase. And within phase 1, we have phase 1A and phase 1B. So we have one patient initially, we give a tiny amount of drug, monitor them very closely, and only if it's safe to do so, do we very slowly and very gradually increase the dose. If it's showing some promise and looking as if there might be some benefit, although at the phase 1 stage, we're not expecting to see a lot of that. But if it's safe to do so, we would then go on to a phase 2 stage. So this is where we're starting to look for the therapeutic effect. So we're starting to look to see what's happening to the body. Is it having some response to the tumour? To be able to analyse that, we need larger numbers of patients. And this is when we start to potentially see some side effects. So the toxicity, looking to see the toxicity, side effects from patients. And that's why we monitor our patients so closely. Because obviously if this is a brand new drug coming through these phases, we have to be ready to anticipate everything. So we're looking for side effects to the treatment. We want to get to a dose, a therapeutic dose that will benefit our patients, but we need to keep them safe. And within that as well, we have phase 2A and phase 2B as we progress through that phase. And then finally, phase 3 of a study. So once we get to the phase 3, hopefully we've made that progress. Lots of our drugs will slip by before then. Lots of them don't make it to the phase 3 stage. But of those that do, by the time we get to the phase 3, we've pretty much found our dose. We know the dose that we want to be giving to give the benefit to our patients. So we've got an idea of what the toxicity profile looks like. We're starting to see some benefit. But to be able to compare that with our gold standard, we need to have larger numbers of patients. And that's why our phase 3 studies tend to be much bigger. And we're always looking to answer a question within a clinical trial. And usually we want to know, is it superior to our current standard of care? Or is it equally as good, but maybe with less side effects? And we're always clear as to what we're looking for. There is always a question to be answered. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to mention the disadvantages first, so we finish on a positive and talk about the advantages. But it's worth noting that there can be disadvantages. Some people see too many follow-up procedures, close monitoring, more visits to hospital as a disadvantage, but not everybody does. Some of our patients like that closer follow-up and closer monitoring, but it's not for everybody, and we're respectful of that. But one potential disadvantage can be the timing when we tend to approach a patient about a clinical trial. It's very often when a patient has just had bad news. So when the patient is ready for a new line of therapy, is very often when they've had some progression or their treatment is no longer working. So the consultant will talk to the patient about a new line of therapy as standard, or if there's a clinical trial, they'll mention a clinical trial. And unfortunately, when many of our patients have had that bad news, that is as much as they can process and take in that day. So some patients will just say, no, can't think about a clinical trial because we've got too much to think about. And that's totally understandable. And we try and work with that. So we don't approach them at that time if we can help it. But unfortunately, very often, that is the time it has to be done. So if that does ever happen to any of you, don't say no immediately. Just keep your options open because you can make your choice. You're not rushed into any decision immediately. Always get time to think about that. The other disadvantage, and it tends to happen in the very earlier phases when we know less about a new drug, might be some unknown side effects. And we monitor our patients extremely carefully and closely. You have access to our phone number 24 hours a day. But those unknown side effects can frighten some people and therefore put some people off. So that's understandable as well. The additional blood sampling, some of our patients are needle phobic by the time we speak to them about clinical trials after all of the treatment they've had. So additional blood sampling can be a bit of a disadvantage as well. And strict eligibility criteria. Because of our new targeted therapies and our immunotherapies, they are only suitable for people who have a specific gene or a specific mutation or an amplification of something. But we have to screen potentially a lot of patients, and not everybody therefore will be eligible to go into that study. And it would be unethical of us to give somebody a drug that it wasn't going to give them any benefit. There's other things to talk about with strict eligibility criteria, so things like blood levels, heart scans, all that sort of thing. We can be quite particular about the levels we're looking for. And I guess the researchers are looking to make sure that if there is a cardiac event, for example, it wasn't because the patient was already compromised rather than it being the drug. But that's a bone of contention, and it's a topic all of its own, which I can do another day. Looking at the advantages, however, so first and foremost, most important, access to an otherwise unavailable drug. A superior treatment to our current standard of care has to be the biggest advantage, I would say. Then, of course, the closer follow-up, the monitoring, potentially more scans and tests if it's in the earliest stages, possibly. Lots of our patients appreciate that and like that. Having that access to a specialist nurse So when you are approached about a clinical trial, the information sheet has a phone number on it, usually of the research nurse's office. And that lovely contact, that ability to be able to pick up the phone and ask a question, something that you're unsure about, is seen as a big benefit for our patients. And one-to-one care. So within our NHS hospitals, we always try to give continuity of care, whether you're in a trial or not. But certainly within a trial, you're much more likely to see the same person over again. And if you're on trial for a long time, which many of our patients are, you build up a really nice, trusting relationship. So how to access a clinical trial? So I could have talked about this on its own, but actually there really isn't that much to say about how to access a clinical trial, because the best thing you can do is speak to your consultant about trials. Whether you're stable on your treatment or not, let them know that you are potentially interested in taking part in a trial. Some patients don't like to ask. Some people like to just wait to be told what their next treatment is. But consultants don't mind. They're happy to have those conversations, and it genuinely is okay to ask about clinical trials, just to raise their awareness that that's something you're prepared to consider. Now, some of you might not be in a very research active hospital. I know some of the patients I've spoken to already in this service are in hospitals where there aren't any clinical trials. But that doesn't mean to say that you can't access them. So by letting your consultant know that you're interested, that triggers that conversation to then make them think slightly differently if they hadn't done before. I'm obviously used to working in the Western, so we have a smallish portfolio. We don't have every study running, but there are other studies running elsewhere, but we are very research active. So it's nice when we know if patients are interested and open to having those discussions. But if we're in a research hospital, our consultants should be approaching our patients anyway. And then, of course, the other thing you can do is use this new Patient Trials Advocate service. So it's only running in the southeast of Scotland at the moment. It's a pilot project. I don't know if some of you might know a little bit about it already. Some of you might even have used the service, but it's me at the moment. But the idea is that I can help people to have conversations about clinical trials, learn more about trials, but also if there's a clinical trial need coming soon, so if there's a scan being done and we're thinking there might be a bit of progression or there is progression, then I can do a search of all of the databases across the UK to see what might be suitable for you at this stage. Now, I take it as far as handing that information back to you for you then to go to your consultant to have that conversation, because ultimately it's your consultant that knows the detail about the type of breast cancer that you have and what is appropriate as a next line of therapy. But it certainly takes a lot of the work out by narrowing that search down to find suitable studies. And there are clinical trials, there's over 50 running clinical trials for patients with secondary breast cancer at this moment in time. But obviously, each cancer centre doesn't have all trials running in all centres. I've just looked at the subtitles and thinking, oh, I didn't say that, did I? Okay, just very quickly, I just thought it might be quite nice just to tell you a little bit about what happens if you are approached about a clinical trial. I'm just going to refer just in case that doesn't show up. So, firstly, your doctor would approach you at clinic, and it's usually to tell you about your next treatment option and if there might be a clinical trial. So, what's the next standard of therapy? And is there a clinical trial as an alternative? If you say, well, I'm not too sure, I'll give that some thought, they will give you an information sheet about the study. So you can take that home and read it and take it at a pace that you can follow and understand and process the other information that the doctor's given you at that time. We always, if it's a drug study, allow a minimum of 24 hours to consider taking part. And we try and give much longer than that. Obviously, if we're looking to start treatment soon, then we can't leave it too long. But if it's a drug study, we would always give a minimum of 24 hours. If it's a translational study or a biomarker type study, then we might take a consent there and then if you were happy to do so, but it doesn't involve a drug. But if you've been open to the suggestion, you're still under no obligation whatsoever. You've just taken the information sheet and you're going to think about it. You have time to ask questions with a research nurse usually, and it's usually in person. But because of COVID, it's more by phone now, but it can easily be by phone. We don't bring you back into the hospital unless you're coming in anyway. So we quite often have those conversations by phone. Answer any questions that you might have about the trial to help you make that decision whether you'd like to participate or not. If you wish to go ahead, we would get you to come back and sign a written informed consent. So give us your consent to take part in this trial. Don't bring you back to hospital just to do that. So we would usually have some baseline tests planned, but we wouldn't do those until we had that written consent. So once we have your consent that you wish to take part in the study, you would then start any baseline tests that were to be done. So we organise those. It might be another CT scan, although if one's been done in the last 2 or 3 weeks, then we wouldn't repeat that. But it might be some blood tests or a heart scan, something like that. Once they've all been completed, and it's appropriate to do so, you would then start your treatment in that dedicated research facility. Closely monitored, closely followed up, with access to a telephone number and us if you need us for anything. And bearing in mind that you can withdraw from a study at any time without giving reason. In the 17 plus years I've been a research nurse, I've never had a patient want to withdraw, but it's nice to know that you can and your care isn't compromised. You would then revert back to the standard of care. So that's me about done. Just to quickly summarise, lots of different types of trials, different phases of clinical trial, and thinking about why that's important because of the extra scans and blood tests, things like that. Remember to speak to your consultant about clinical trials and that it is okay to ask them about these things. Placebos might be used. We don't use them very often, but if it's appropriate to do so, then we will, but it doesn't compromise your care in any way. That you can withdraw from a study at any time. And I believe that there are significant advantages to taking part in clinical trials. And please feel free to use the Patient Trials Advocate Service, referral forms on the website, just for the South East of Scotland just now, but I think we're going to be expanding that quite soon. I'm quite hopeful of that. So keep an eye out for that if you're not in the South East of Scotland. So I think that's me. So I'm ready for whatever anybody has for me. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Sorry guys, I'm just going to unmute there. Thank you so much, Vivienne. That was a really, really fantastic presentation. Thank you. Lots of really useful information. I'm sure everyone that's on the call will agree. So yeah, we've got a couple of questions that have popped in. So I'll start with the first one from Louise, which is, how long is this current pilot running for and are there next steps planned for the rollout elsewhere?
Thanks, Louise. So yes, it's a new service. It started 4 months ago and it's covering the South East of Scotland just now, but we're hoping to expand it. So we're coming to the end of the first pilot at the end or mid-July it is. So we're in month 3 just now. So we're going to be reviewing it, starting to kind of review what we're doing already and hoping to expand it shortly after there.
Fabulous. And if your hospital doesn't offer a certain trial, how can people access them?
So there are, excuse me, some hospitals that I know of in Scotland don't have any clinical trials. Not to say that you can't participate. We have patients in Edinburgh that have relocated from London and travel from Newcastle. We have patients in Edinburgh that go to Glasgow for treatment. So certainly cared for a patient who came from Ayr, came to Edinburgh. So it can be organised. Just because your hospital doesn't run clinical trials in your locality doesn't mean to say that you can't take part. Unfortunately, it does mean that you have the potential of travelling, which isn't always a great thing. Some of our district hospitals, I know, having worked covering the southeast of Scotland, we have a small group of studies in Dumfries, Borders and Fife, but they can't deliver the very early phase studies. So if it's an unlicensed product, it needs to be delivered in a dedicated research facility. So some of our patients do come over to Edinburgh for trials then in that case.
So I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this one, Vivienne, but you mentioned on your presentation that your role obviously covers the pilot area, and we understand that, but what you'd said was that you searched right across the UK for appropriate trials, and that there were just 50 trials taking place currently. Is there a way that the patients can have that information shared with a short synopsis of what the trial was and where it was taking place? And when is it planned to roll out the service to the other areas of the UK? So sorry, there's like 2 or 3 questions in there.
Right, so you might need to remind me of the, so I'll probably not answer it all, I'll forget. But now, what was it?
Basically saying, obviously you talked about there being 50 trials across the UK and that obviously you're only covering a certain area.
Yeah.
Is there a way that the information can be shared with a short synopsis of what the trial was and where it was taking place? Is that something that you can do within your role?
Okay, right, stop there. So what I would say is the issue is the short synopsis is quite complex in itself. So on any of these databases, they will give you a short synopsis. So if you went on to one website, they would give you, if you typed in metastatic breast cancer or advanced breast cancer, you would get a list and they would give you a short synopsis. And the easiest way to do that would be actually just to share that link with you. The reason for this role is because to break that down, there's lots of eligibility and appropriateness. So there's another database that will do a search for you, but they don't have the detail of a patient's breast cancer or a knowledge of what's appropriate. So you can have a short synopsis very easily just by typing, advanced breast cancer in any one of these databases, and they will give you a summary, and it will say for patients who are ER positive and HER2 negative. But then when you start looking at the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, they're looking at how many lines of therapy have they had. They might want you to have had a CDK6 inhibitor. So that throws people as soon as you get started on that. So you can certainly get an easy summary. That's easy to organise, but it doesn't narrow the search down very much. So when I do a search, there's more than 50. I think the last time I have to check the databases every week, and I think there is about at least 10 studies that look at breast cancer as a potential. So some of the very early studies, they've got this new drug from the lab that looks and shows promise, but they don't know if it's going to benefit bowel cancer, stomach cancer, breast cancer, or something along those lines. So they will try it in solid tumours. So there's a good few of those. I don't tend to include them because I'm not just breast cancer. There's about 50 others besides that just for breast cancer. And there's triple negative breast cancer. There's people for specific genetic mutations. So it's quite confusing. Confuses me. So it's difficult. Was there another part to the question, Emma?
It was really just more about if you know more about when the service, if we're planning to roll it out to other areas of the UK, and do we kind of know where those areas will be, or is it too early to tell yet?
So it's not for me to finally decide. I give my sort of feedback as to what's happening and what the activity's been like and things, but it's looking very positive. And because we're coming up to the end of the 3 months soon, I think my expectation is that we will expand it to Scotland next, and then looking beyond Scotland after that. So we've got a year. We've got a year to do what we're doing.
Yeah,
it's moving very quickly, I have to say. I mean, I came into post in mid-February with nothing in place, and we're running a service now already. So the speed it's going, I'm quite hopeful that by the end of the year, it will be way beyond the southeast of Scotland. And just to say as well, if anybody is desperately looking for a study, I wouldn't turn anybody away. So I don't have the capacity to give service to everybody at this moment in time. But if somebody said to me, I have my CT scan, I've got some progression, could somebody help me find a treatment? I would do that and have already done that.
Yeah.
So it is there.
Fantastic. So one of the questions that I was kind of thinking about was more about the role itself, and how important do you think having a PTA role is for, particularly for secondary breast cancer or for the patients within our community?
I think it's fabulous. I mean, I hadn't thought of it. Some of our consultants get in touch or do a search themselves on the databases, but it is very time consuming because you're filtering 50 studies. And you can't just look at the synopsis, you have to read the 2-page inclusion exclusion criteria. So it's a lengthy process. So it's a fabulous idea. There's only me with secondary breast cancer, and there's a lovely lady called Helen who does it in blood cancer. Okay. There's just the two of us. It's a very popular service in America, apparently, but there's myself and Helen at the moment in the UK that are delivering this service. From other healthcare professionals, we've had some really positive feedback as well. So my colleagues in Edinburgh and across the southeast of Scotland are really keen to learn more. I've certainly had other charities contacting me to find out more about the service and can they put patients my way. So I think it is something that's potentially going to grow and grow. And, you know, my other job is with Cancer Research UK. So I'm the lead nurse for the Edinburgh Cancer Centre. And, you know, if we can do this for secondary breast cancer, where else could we go with this? You know, it's a great service. And it's not for everybody, but you know, it's got huge potential.
And I suppose one of the things about it is that obviously that role then allows you to do a lot of the work that maybe the oncologists or your team don't necessarily have that time to research. But if you can do that part for them and then take that to them, that in itself is a huge service for patients, isn't it?
Definitely. I suppose it still comes back to the consultant. So after I've done a search, you know, there can be a number of studies that are available. So it might be, you know, I can get a feel of what's appropriate to send. So I could do a general search for somebody and come up with lots of studies, but it wouldn't be appropriate. So some of the earlier phase studies, it's not necessary. Yes, they're eligible, but no consultant would suggest that for their patient at that moment in time. But, you know, so it's finding something that's appropriate. But ultimately, whatever I send it in a PDF document, and it's usually 2 or 3 pages long. They then have to take that back to the consultant to have those conversations, because I don't have anybody's medical records in front of me. So for all I can narrow the search down, it's their consultant that knows if something's appropriate or not, I would say.
Yeah. So how have you found the pilot role so far? Are you enjoying it? It's obviously keeping you very busy, I imagine.
It is. It's a very part-time job as well. So I have 2 roles. I work in Cancer Research UK, and this makes seconds count, and it's only 2 days a week, but it does get into day 3 and day 4 sometimes as well. But it's lovely. There's lots going on. I mean, just laying the foundations, you know, doing the risk assessments, doing all sorts of policies and processes and procedures. We had to put those in place first to deliver any kind of a service. So you've got to do that background stuff first. But we got up and running very quickly. You know, I remember Helen talking from blood cancer. I think she was about 6 months before they were kind of up and running. So we did get cracking quite quickly.
Yeah, no, you did do it. We're off to a flyer right away as soon as we started, really, weren't we? Yeah. So one of the other questions that's popped in, oh, sorry, it's just moved. There's another one. 2 seconds. Is there any potential funding availability from, say, the pharmaceutical companies to support the role? Do you think that's something we could look into?
Yeah, definitely. Pharmaceutical companies, I'm sure, would be delighted to get on board. They certainly do. With the blood cancer aspect, they certainly do some funding there. So yeah, definitely.
certainly an area to look at, I suppose.
As long as they didn't want us to be biased and promote their trial
Well,
above anybody else.
Well, that's it. Obviously, it has to be. Yeah, absolutely. So Louise has also asked if there was more work done on filters and search interface for this database, would that help patients to find trials themselves, or is it too complicated for that approach?
It's a good question. The databases that are available, so there are 7 databases that I know about that I use, but I have 2 or 3 favorites. So I have my local one that the NHS uses, so I can see what hospitals are doing, but it's only as good as the people who put the information on. The other databases are UK wide, and if you want, there's 1 or 2 that you can go beyond. So if I was looking for a study, if somebody had run out of treatment options and they were prepared to go abroad, there's 1 or 2 databases I could use. Some filter, so you could write, when you do, in some of the search engines, you can say HER2 breast cancer, but the search engines, it's a machine, isn't it? Sometimes, you know, like, so if I try and filter it down myself, I end up potentially losing studies. So if you wanted to say, look at triple negative breast cancer, you would then get studies that weren't relevant as well. So you then still have to filter through something else. So some are better than others, but a filter would be a great idea. I think we should write to them and tell them.
I think we'll make a note of that one for,
yeah,
for after this.
There's one I do really like. I suppose the thing is, though, the difficulty is there. It's the interpretation of the information that they've put on. So I think that's probably why they don't have the filters, because I'm thinking about one study. Sometimes you'd read it and it's a bit ambiguous. So when it's uploaded onto this database, it talks about second line therapy. So somebody might be eligible if they've had as a second line treatment, but actually when you read it, they're only allowing you to have, say, 1 line of hormones or 3 lines of chemotherapy. So it gets quite confusing. So if you filter, my worry would be if you filtered it, you would actually filter some good stuff out there. So
yeah, I mean, Louise has literally just said there, she was asking because she's a user interface designer married to a programmer. So maybe there's a trial.
We'll have a chat. Never mind just developing the service, we'll just take over.
Yeah. So do you think everyone, no matter where they are, should have access to a PTA type role? Do you think it shouldn't really matter where you're based in the UK? There should be one available in.
100%. It's unfair that we've got, for anybody who's not in the southeast of Scotland, it's unfair, but we have to start somewhere. And
yeah,
you know, there was no point me giving up, you know, sort of doing this full time if there was no need for it. So this was very much the pilot to see if it was going to be any good. I think we're quickly realizing that there's something to go with it. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think it will grow. And I think the fact that we are moving as quickly as we are, I think we can quickly advance there. But I think we need another member of staff, and recruitment can sometimes be a bit slow. Yeah. Especially if we go down the NHS route.
Yeah. So those are obviously going to be then, I guess, what we think about next towards the end of this pilot scheme is then how the pilot went in terms of, you know, the trial and who we've helped, but also the logistics of, you know, rolling it out into other parts of the UK and what that's going to involve in terms of staff and how many days it's going to take and all the things that, you know, you just don't usually think about, but you have to.
Yeah, definitely. So we're starting to have those conversations about what we could potentially do, where we potentially want to go, but there's a few people involved, you know, so it needs to kind of still be discussed in a bit more detail.
Someone's asking, without betraying any confidentiality, are you able to tell us how many patients have currently used the pilot service just now, or is that anything you're allowed to share with us?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's a problem at all. So this is just the beginning of month 3. So in the 2 months, I think we've helped 18, I think. And that, you know, when I first sort of set, when we were kind of reviewing month 1, I think it was kind of about 9, 10, something like that. And I was thinking, oh, that's not very many. But actually, because it's a new service and it's quite bespoke, it actually is really, really amazing. And I spoke to the girl in Blood Cancer UK, and I was saying, oh, I've only seen 4. And he was like, that's mad, that's huge. Because the thing is as well, it's not always you've done the search and that's it. Some people need a bit more, and it's a kind of rolling service. So it might be that they're thinking about trials, but then they want to come back with questions. So it's not you complete the search and then you hand it over. It can be. So there's been a real mixture.
So it's going to be a mixture of kind of a one-stop shop, if you like, but also then helping people further on, and then maybe someone that you've spoken to originally might come back at a later date because either something's changed or they're looking for more. So there will always be that kind of back and forth with the patients.
And that's happening already.
Yeah. And that's amazing, just obviously given it's just the first pilot, that you're already seeing that's obviously how it's going to work going forward as well.
I mean, I've changed as well, so I put a lot of thought into it. So obviously it's just me. So I put a lot of thought into what information I needed to enable to, without being invasive and, being too personal for the thing. But, if you're going to do a good service and give something that's appropriate, you need quite a bit of information. So it's not overwhelming people with too much too quickly. But I do change tacks all the time as we're sort of developing the service, and try to be as flexible as I can be. Some people rather do things by email or by phone, that sort of thing, and all's fine, but it's constantly being adapted.
So what are your hopes for the future then, within the role, or just where you would like to see it go, really? I suppose, where would you like
that's a nice question. That's a nice question. So I guess ultimately I'm an NHS nurse anyway, so the worst case scenario would be, Vivienne, you're rubbish, get back to your day job. But so
I'm sure that would happen, by the way. That's definitely not going to be on the cards.
But it's a year's project. So I've committed. So my manager approached me and I've come over to do this for a year. So I suppose it depends where we are in a year's time. And it depends how big we are. I'd love to see it through. I think there's so much other stuff we can do. And on 2 days, it's probably not, it's difficult to do.
Not enough time.
The databases, just checking the databases could take me 2 days, to be honest. Knowing what's out there, and sometimes you'll find something and then you go and search for it again, you can't find it. And I know in Edinburgh that there's a couple of studies that are closed, but on the databases they say they're open. So that's great because I have that link. So I always want that link. And I love my CR UK job as well. I do lots of training and education with nurses, and so I like that aspect of my job. So I love the variety.
The 2 different things that you're doing.
But I love talking to patients. I love hearing their stories. I love listening. I like listening to what they have to say and how important all of that is, and if I can do anything to make that journey a little bit better, then that's fabulous, So I hope to be doing it for a little while, and I hope I can help support who comes on next. Because obviously this is my way of doing things. I don't want to start training them to do it my way. I would like to see how they do it their way, but be there as a support, So I'd like to be able to do that for a little while.
Fantastic. Juliet's just asked the question, is there any advice on not falling into the pitfall of missing out on trials because already had other treatments? She kind of thinks the burden for this rests too much on the patient sometimes.
Yeah, good question. I suppose it depends where you live, because if you are in a research active hospital, your doctor should always be thinking about what's your next standard of care and what's an alternative. Is there a clinical trial for you? If they don't have a clinical trial in that hospital, they might not say, well, she'll not want to go to Newcastle, she'll not want to go to Glasgow or whatever, and make that assumption. So that's why I suppose what I was saying in the presentation, how important it is to let your consultant know that you're interested in clinical trials. And have that conversation now, and let them know if you're prepared to travel, because you're absolutely right. As standard of cares go, there are lots of variations on the theme. So when somebody's giving me their history, and you've had eribulin and capecitabine and lots of other different treatments, you're then having to rule those, sort of make sure that that's okay to have. So there should always be other studies available, but it might be a case, and your consultant might make that decision. So as a next line of therapy, they might give you something and think this is the best thing that I think will be suitable. But it might have been that there was a clinical trial there, but because they can give you a treatment, they go down that treatment route. So the best advice I could give there is to start having those conversations to say, please, I'm interested in clinical trials, and I'm not saying I want to go into every clinical trial there is, but I want to be considered and I'm prepared to travel. So can we have those conversations? Yeah. Does that answer your question? I can see you, Juliet, so if you nod, or feel free to take your microphone off.
Yeah, everyone feel free to, we've got about 5 minutes left, so if you want to unmute if anyone's got any final.
Go for it, Juliet.
Thanks. So it's just that I'm at Edinburgh, it's in Cambridge, which is like quite a centre for research. But I did mention, well, it was to my oncology nurse, but she just said, oh, you don't need to worry about trials at all, like for, you know, there's lots of treatments. But I wouldn't like to, like I've heard of other people saying that they can't get onto trials because they've already had treatments. I wouldn't want to rule myself out of them by just thinking, oh, it's fine, I can access them later on, and then find I can't, sort of thing.
Yes. So there will always be, so the very early phase studies, so that drug that we have in the laboratory that we think might be fabulous, but we don't know until we give it to patients with secondary breast cancer. Those studies very often will say, have exhausted all standard care treatments. But there's other studies, and it's the other studies that you might receive a treatment, and therefore, if you've already had paclitaxel with fulvestrant, and then there's a study as a next line, and it's no point giving you that again. So it's not to say that your care has been compromised in any way because you've had that drug, but it's by having those conversations to say, well, actually, where I am now, what are those options? So it would be interesting to see what options are there for you. And we won't know just exactly what treatment is for you until you're ready for that treatment. Because I've done a couple of searches for patients who are actually stable and, you know, have really just started on the treatment, but doing what you're possibly doing, Juliet, you know, looking to see, well, what's next? So what is there a clinical trial? So I do that for them, but I'm always very conscious that trials open and close. They can be open for many years, but it can also open and close quickly. Or when we're doing a search, they're coming to the end of their recruitment. So it's pertinent, you know, that it's at that moment in time or within that short time frame. So the best thing I would say is the fact of where you live as well. You live relatively near some big cancer centres who have some of the biggest portfolios. You don't have them all, but there's a lot of trials out there. So I think the best thing you could do is have that conversation with your consultant.
Louise has just popped another wee question in there saying, do you have a rough idea of how many trials pop up, for example, every month in the UK?
Yeah, so we've been quite consistent. So I did a search. I've got the number somewhere. It stays about 50. So 1 or 2 studies are closing. There are periods when it can be quite quiet, and then other times when there's a flurry. COVID has had an impact on new studies coming through. I know there was, you know, COVID's another conversation, isn't it? We kept all of our patients who were on a clinical trial on a clinical trial. They kept receiving their treatment despite what the media was saying. So that it was quite frustrating at times. But obviously trials were paused to new recruitment. So it's taking some centres quite a while to get back into the swing of things. So I'm probably not seeing a true reflection of what it's normally like. But you know, initially when I started, every week I was going onto the databases, I was finding a new one, but at the same time, another one would be closing. And researchers try and have a portfolio of studies. So Edinburgh will say, well, we're a relatively small centre. We're not going to have 2 studies that are looking at exactly the same group of patients. So they will make their choice, but that other study will run somewhere else. But some studies recruit much quicker than others as well. Some are less specific. So you might have a study where it's looking for all patients who are HER2 positive, or it might be somebody who's looking, you know, just a study for somebody with a specific gene, and therefore the numbers, so it takes longer to recruit those kind of thing. So I would say 1 or 2 routinely, I see differently. I'll very often say, oh, don't have that one, right? What's that? But likewise, at the same time, the numbers tend to stay fairly stable because other studies are closing as well.
Okay, fantastic. So that's us pretty much at past. That's been a fantastic hour. So thank you very much, Vivienne. I just want to check, does anyone have anything quickly last minute that they'd like to ask Vivienne before we let her go? Just lots of people saying fantastic and thank you, Vivienne. So yeah, thank you so much for what was an incredibly interesting chat. I know I've learned so much just from your presentation and chat today, so I'm hopeful that everyone else is in the same position as me. So yeah, thank you. And if anyone is in the southeast of Scotland at the moment and would like to use or reach out to Vivienne, obviously the details are on our website. Please do get in touch. But yeah, thank you very much, Vivienne, for this fantastic first session on Wednesday.
Very welcome. Lovely to see some of you.
Yeah.
And Juliet, obviously, I just know yourself, you know, if you were particularly interested, I'd be happy, just do a referral. And obviously I can't do it for everybody, but if you wanted to find out a wee bit more, get in quick though.
Absolutely.
I don't know how many people are on this line. I might regret saying
Look,
that.
you might end up with 12 plus referrals in a minute.
Don't put that on your website.
Yeah, don't let anyone know that we've said this, right? Okay. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. That's been a wonderful hour, and we'll see you at the next session. All righty.
Bye now.
Take care.
Thank you.
Care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.